I used to go to New York, they called me Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. It was 1950. The space age was nowhere in sight. So I'd meet a bunch of ballet dancers or surgeons or lawyers, and they'd say, "Hi, Buck Rogers. Hi, Flash Gordon." So I went around one night in New York in 1950 or 51, and I had a little pad and pencil with me, and I said, "Sir, your name and phone number, please. And ma'am, your name and phone number. And sir, yours, please." And they said, "Why are you taking our phone numbers and names?" I said, "Because the night we landed on the moon, you're going to get called." And the night we landed on the moon, I made 3 phone calls to 3 of these people. And when they answered, I said, "Stupid son of a bitch," and hung up. Comeuppance time. But that's a long time ago.
Ray Douglas Bradbury has had a busy life. He has colonized Mars, helped a beautiful Irish ghost murder a famous film director. He's created a time machine where men could go hunt dinosaurs. He's burned all the world's great books, brought a drowned girl back from the dead. He has kidnapped a parrot that knew Hemingway, killed a perfect copy of his wife, fed his parents to wild African lions. He has invented a Ferris wheel where going backward you become younger, forward older. He has rebuilt the House of Usher and thrown a housewarming party where he tortured the guests. And in doing all this and more, Ray Bradbury has become an icon in the world of contemporary science fiction, a writer whose imagination has opened up a whole new world of fantasy and wonder.
Come in, won't you? In this house, copper bats fly in make-believe attics. Brass rats scuttle in plastic cellars. Robot skeletons rattle in dreary closets.
Robot skeletons?
Vampires, wolves, phantoms, done with chemicals and ingenuity.
I was afraid of that.
In this world, a young girl plays a gigantic part in the life of a writer who happens to be a dwarf.
The beautiful giant lady came to the little house in the middle of nowhere.
Here a man can decide to do battle with the profusion of modern technology, armed only with a chocolate milkshake.
Any special reason why you chose a chocolate milkshake?
It's my favorite flavor.
Miss Weldon, do I scare you?
In Bradbury's universe, a dead man can find love in a small town.
Kate, will you marry me?
I've got me a letter. Read it to me.
An illiterate woman can wait half a lifetime to receive her very first letter.
What's it say?
It's from the Power Plus Muscle Company. And it says, "Dear Mrs. Gibbs."
Dear Mrs. Gibbs. Dear Mrs. Gibbs.
Ray Bradbury has given birth to thousands of different characters and situations, yet all are firmly rooted in a deep sense of humanity, a humanity he has made spring from the genesis of science fiction.
The cavemen wrote the first science fictions on the walls of the caves, those pictographs of problems to be solved. How do you kill a mammoth? That's a science fictional problem, isn't it? So you have to invent something, don't you, to kill the mammoth. You can't hit him with your fists. So you got a knife, that won't work. You've got a hatchet, that won't work. What do? You take off your arm and throw it at him, and that's called a spear. You invent an arm that extends your ability to destroy. So that's pure science fiction. And that you start with those primitive science fictional problems and you solve them and you move on to the next problem. So our entire history is ideas and problem solving.
He was born in 1920 in the small town of Waukegan, Illinois. They weren't rich. His father worked as a lineman for the local power company. 2 of the 4 Bradbury children had died in the flu epidemic that swept America, and Esther Bradbury was taking no chances with her baby. She pampered Ray, bottle-feeding him until he was 6 years old.
She was afraid. She was afraid that her baby might die. And my sister died when I was 7. So that only increased the attention. We got off the bottle when I was 6. But I was still spoon-fed a good part of my life until I was 13 or 14. I went shopping with her, all the female things. I was turned into to a mother's child, a mama's boy. I caught her colds, and then later I had to get rid of them.
In 1932, when the traveling carnival came to Waukegan, the 12-year-old mama's boy was enthralled by a performer named Mr. Electrico. It was an event he has claimed ever since that changed his life forever.
He was remarkable. He traveled with this carnival. Dill Brothers combined shows, combined out of what God knows. But every night he sat in the electric chair and they'd electrocute him. And they'd pull a switch and all this amperage would jump into his body, his hair would stand up, and sparks would fly out of his mouth. And he took a sword and passed it down among the audience, and he came to me and put the edge of the sword against my nose, and the electricity went into my head, came out my ears, made my hair stand up. And he pointed at me and cried, "Live forever." And I said, wow, boy, is that good advice. I wonder how you do that. And I decided to go see him the next day, and I knew I couldn't say, "How do you live forever?" But I'd try to make up something. Took a magic trick out of my pocket, and I asked him to show me how to do it. And he showed me how to do it, and then he looked into my face, and he says, "You want to look behind the scenes here? You want to meet all the people?" I said, "Yeah." So he ran over to the tent, and he hit it with his cane. And he called out, "Clean up your language. Clean up your language." And we went in, and I met the illustrated man and the skinny lady and the fat lady and the trapeze people. And then he took me down to the lake shore, and we sat on the dunes. And he talked his small philosophies, and he let me talk my big ones. Paid attention, looked me right in the face. And finally, during the discussion, he said, "You know, we've met before." I said, "Oh, no, sir, this is the first time I've ever talked to you." "No, you were my best friend in the great battle of the Ardennes Forest outside of Paris in October of 1918. And you were wounded and you died in my arms. And now here you are back in the world with a new name, a new face. But the soul shining out of your eyes is the soul of my friends. Welcome back to the world." This is incredible. Why did he do that? Why did he do that, huh? It must have been my love, my ardent pursuit of life that showed in my face. It had to be that. That's the only thing I can think of, that it showed that I really cared about him and magic and living forever. I never asked him the question directly, but he gave me the gift. You've already had a life in the past, and you've got one in the future. Now go get it. Within 8 weeks, I began to write full time, and I've never stopped in the 62, 63 years since. And that's all Mr. Electrico is catalyst.
Since that conversation with Mr. Electrico, Ray Bradbury's imagination and prose have filled volumes of stories that have amused and scared and entertained generations. There are poems, essays, novels, TV series, movies, comic books. Then here at the Colony Theater in suburban Los Angeles, a new production of 7 one-act plays.
It's Grinnell, Iowa.
Greentown.
The producer who has been trying to come to grips with the world of Ray Bradbury is Barbara Beckley.
We start out on the coast of Maine with the foghorn, and then we go to a post-apocalyptic eastern city with Chicago Abyss, and then we're out in space with Kaleidoscope, and then we're on Mars, but are we really, with the third landing? To say nothing of, and that's just the first act, you know. Then we get to the second act, and we're in a whole different place. Pillar of Fire, are you familiar with that? It's like you read it and you think, oh, how are we going to do this? Because it's Ray at his most, what's the word? It's at his most profligate, is that the right word? Where there's so many images and so many different places and ideas floating around, that trying to harness all of that and put it up here that's work. If you're doing an Irish play or an Australian play or whatever, and the actors aren't that familiar with the place at the time, they can go to the library and research it. But if the play is about a society that Ray has imagined that exists 300 years from now, where do you go to research that? You know, you have to kind of figure it out and figure out how to put it up here in theatrical terms. And that's the challenge, and that's what's so exciting about it too, because there's so many possibilities.
This is the world Ray Bradbury has created and populated, a world where fantasy is always bordering on reality and reality on fantasy, and no one is really sure what's going to happen next.
Mr. Stendhal, what exactly is going on here?
Murder.
Murder?
Murder most foul.
Bradbury on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Just what does it take?
1934, a new nerdy-looking kid started hanging around the gates of the Hollywood studios, pestering stars for autographs and pictures. He posed with George Burns. He posed with Marlene Dietrich. The kid was Ray Bradbury.
When I arrived in Hollywood when I was 13, I wanted to meet famous people, so I put on my roller skates, skated out to Hollywood, and there, standing in front of Paramount Studios, waiting for me, was the hero of all the generations, Mr. W.C. Fields himself. So I skated over to him, and I handed him a pen. I said, "Mr. Fields, can I have your autograph?" He handed it back and said, "There you are, you little son of a bitch." And that was my invitation into Hollywood. Never saw him again after that, but boy, oh boy, what an encounter.
Like thousands of other families struggling through the Great Depression, the Bradburys had moved from Illinois to find work in the West. They finally ended up in Los Angeles. But although he would grow up in a big city, it was the romantic vision of small-town America that stayed and became a constant in the work of the young Bradbury boy.
Blackie, you're just in time. We got an apricot pie cooling on the back window. Got lemonade in the fridge. Got a band concert tonight. Fireworks at 9. You hear that? Race you home. Last one there is an old maid. No, wait, skip.
Ray's father got a job with the local power company and eventually moved his family into this house in Venice, California.
This house here is where I live with my parents and my brother. And it's part of the Bureau of Power and Light Edison Company property. So we lived here. We paid $30 a month to live here, which was kind of expensive because the average income in those days was $15 a week. Huh? So we stayed poor for a long time. Huh? We were all happy because we never talked about poverty. Huh? If you're living in the midst of it, why discuss it? Get your work done. I learned how to sneak into every movie in Los Angeles. I knew all the owners, the proprietors of the movie houses, and I'd buy them a pack of cigarettes or a 3-cent newspaper and get in the movies free. Huh? So you learn all the ways around, and you learn to live in the library where you get your education free. Huh? And there are no excuses. There are no excuses. So you make yourself as you go.
Ray graduated from Los Angeles High School in 1938, as did classmate Betty Williams, who still has the yearbook.
There he is, right there. Very small, I'm sure. Ray Douglas Bradbury likes to write stories, admired as a thespian, headed for literary distinction. He knew that in 1938.
That's right.
He knew it then. And he did what he intended. That's really beautiful.
Although she didn't know it at the time, Betty Williams was Ray Bradbury's first love.
Oh, well.
I never knew.
We knew each other 56 years ago. And just out of high school, I used to take her to movies. And on the way home from the movie, I say, "Okay, Ray, when we get to her house, she opens the door, you grab her elbows, and you give her a big smooch, okay?" So we'd get to her house, she'd open the door, and I'd say, "Night," and then I walk down the street saying, "Dummy, dummy, dummy." And then this happened 2 or 3 times, so I never got to kiss her goodnight. So About 20 years ago, I was lecturing downtown at the Unitarian Church. I look in the front row, and there's Betty sitting there looking up at me. She came up after and said, I hear you don't drive. I said, that's right. She said, can I give you a ride home? I said, yes. So she drove me home. When we got in front of the house, I reached over, grabbed her elbows, and gave her a big smooch. And then we fell apart laughing. I said, I should have done that 40 years ago. But maybe just as well, huh?
I'm sure you had the right woman. She was wonderful.
Well,
his older brother Skip brought home some money playing semi-professional football. Young Ray made $10 a week selling afternoon newspapers on the street corner. It was the only regular job Ray Bradbury would ever have. But while the fun days of high school were over, his education, he decided, should continue.
This is the downtown children's literature section of the downtown LA library. I started coming here when I was 13 years old. I never left, I'm a children's writer. I didn't realize it when I began writing my short stories and novels many years ago. But I loved Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology, all the children's books, and I assimilated them. And when I began to write full-time, I never left this library. I couldn't go to college, couldn't afford it. So I came here to this room and this building 3 days a week for 10 years and graduated from the library when I was 27 years old. So what you see here is a completely library-oriented writer.
In the late 30s and early 40s, he was one of the young writers and artists who showed up for the weekly meetings of the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, founded by Forrest Ackerman, who still remembers the young Ray Bradbury.
It's a wonder that he's still alive. He was such a rambunctious, such an obnoxious kid. We were ready to strangle him. He would come to the club and he would do his impersonations of W.C. Fields and Hitler. And I say it's really amazing that he got past his youthhood.
The short stories he'd been writing in high school were now being sent off to the pulp magazines, where he hoped to collect a penny a word. He wrote them, he rewrote them, and polished them, and then waited for the inevitable rejection slips.
It's a very interesting thing when you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and getting rejections all the time and writing a short story every week, millions and millions of words. You don't even notice. Yeah, you're momentarily bothered, but you figure they're all stupid, huh? They don't recognize your genius, and someday they will. And so I suppose your ego keeps you going, and you look back later and the stuff really is dreadful. It shouldn't have been bought by anyone. But slowly, one by one, you sell short stories, and even one sale in a year is enough to keep your spirits up.
The short stories kept going out and rejection slips kept coming back until 1940, when Script magazine accepted a story. He didn't get paid for it. Instead, they gave him free copies so he could show the people who bought his newspapers that he was a published writer.
In 1941, I sold a story to Super Science, and then later that year, I think I sold another one, and then in 42, 2 or 3 stories. It began to increase, and then it was 6 stories in the next year, then 12. And then 24. It doubled every year. And then all of a sudden, I was selling 42 short stories in a year, one a week, just about. So it all paid off, and a lot of those stories are very good.
Ray Bradbury was turning out story after story now and making just enough money to give up the newspaper corner. But he wasn't happy with his work. There was something missing until, in what would be a major literary turning point, he wrote a short story called The Lake.
All of my stories that are worth anything are based on some sort of personal metaphor. And when I was 8 years old, a little girl went in Lake Michigan I was playing with, and she never came out. And what a mystery it was. And to hear about this thing called drowning and death. And she stayed with me for 12, 13, 14 years. The memory of her disappearing into the lake. And when I was 22, I sat at the typewriter one day and remembered the lake and wrote the story of this girl and building a sandcastle with her, and very late in time coming back, and there's a sandcastle waiting on the shore. She's been there and left the metaphor of her death for me. And when I finished the short story, I burst into tears. I realized that after 10 years of writing, I'd finally written something beautiful. I turned a corner into my interior self. I wasn't writing exterior stuff. I wasn't writing for the right or the left or the in-between. I was writing for me. And I discovered that was the way to go.
When the Best American Short Stories of 1946 were published, it included a story by 26-year-old Ray Bradbury called The Big Black and White Game. At the local bookstore, when he went to check it out, he noticed an attractive young clerk couldn't take her eyes off him. Her name was Maggie McClure, and she thought he was a thief.
The owner, Mr. Fowler, said, Marguerite, in your department, we have noticed there are books missing. And I said, I'll keep an eye out. And he said, but don't say anything. Come and get me. Watch, but don't say anything. Ray, in July, wearing a British Army officer's greatcoat, ammo pockets, the whole thing, and a briefcase, which he would throw down on the book counter. I thought, ammo pockets, inside deep pockets, outside deep pockets, and a briefcase. This has got to be the one.
And they thought maybe I had a secret flap there to grab books with. Well, it wasn't true, but she kept an eye on me, and then I kept an eye on her, and next thing you know, we're engaged.
And he said, do you have a lunch break? And I said, oh, yes. And he said, would you care to have a cup of coffee? And we went around the corner and had a cup of coffee. And every day he came in and we had a cup of coffee. And a year later, we were married.
Her friends warned her not to marry me. And they said, he's not going anywhere. And I said to her, I'm going to the moon and I'm going to Mars. You want to come along? And she said, yes. And that's the best yes I ever heard in my life. It turned out to be just right.
They were married in 1947 and moved to a little apartment near Venice Beach. They had no money problems. After all, Ray had $7 in the bank.
I gave $5 to the minister. He said, what's this? I said, that's your fee for the ceremony. He said, you're a writer, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, then you're going to need this. And he handed it to me, and I took it back.
Colorful taste, wishbone rice, colorful taste in every...
The pulp magazines where Bradbury had honed his craft were being left behind. The legitimate world was discovering this new California writer. He won the O. Henry Award for short story writing when he was only 28. Now the big magazines were buying McCall's, Esquire, Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, and by 1950 he had developed a series of short stories into a collection called The Martian Chronicles. The Chronicles explored a time when Earth set out to colonize Mars, but Bradbury's stories didn't dwell on the machines that got them there. He was more concerned with what Earthlings would find when they finally landed on the fourth planet from the sun.
Trees. Grass. Birds, roosters, trees? Can't be.
Hey, hold on. My God, that can't be.
On Bradbury's Mars, strange and terrifying things would happen. But as with all great science fiction,
what if the Martians knew we were coming?
There would always be a plausible explanation.
How would they prepare for our arrival? For our invasion, as they might say it.
How?
Telepathy? Hypnosis? Suppose the Martians could borrow our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, and use them as weapons against us with telepathy and hypnosis. My God, they could become our aunts and uncles, mothers and fathers.
Then all of the people in this town
are Martians disguised as Earth people.
What about me, Blackie?
You're not my brother.
That's right. I'm a beast. I'm a monster. And I'm gonna kill you in your sleep.
Where you going, Blackie?
As well as colonizing Mars, Bradbury was turning out other work that would eventually make him famous. He wrote The Illustrated Man in 1951, and in 1952 was again in the anthology of Best American Short Stories. Ray and Maggie had 2 of their 4 daughters by now, and he needed a quiet place to work. He found it in the basement of the UCLA library, where they rented typewriters for $0.10 a half hour. It was here he spent $9.80 writing his first novel, Fahrenheit 451.
I didn't even try to write novels until very late in time. I was in my early 30s when I finally wrote Fahrenheit, and I did it first as a novella, 25,000 words long, which I wrote in 9 days. It's easy to do that when you're excited. And I had an idea, the metaphor was so powerful, of burning books instead of putting out fires. So you reverse the role of the fireman. Once you get that idea, it's terrific, huh? And I wrote the book in the library at UCLA downstairs in the typing room, which means that every half hour or so, I'd run upstairs and touch the books and open the books and smell the books and read the books and find all kinds of things that I'd never seen before. And then I'd take those books down and I'd quote from them in the body of the novel. So I sort of blundered into the longer form gradually. And 2 years later, I added another 25,000 words to Fahrenheit, and I had a 50,000-word novel at long last, my very first one. But I just didn't know how to create something large, and I had to learn how to emotionally allow my characters to flesh out the thing. You can't structure it ahead. There are a lot of people think you can plot a novel. You can't. You have to let people live. And if they lead big lives, you've got a novel. If they lead small ones, you got a short story.
Named for the temperature at which paper burns, Fahrenheit 451 takes place in a future society where firemen are hired by the state to destroy books and the people who read them. The danger of totalitarian states would become a theme in Ray Bradbury's work, and he would return to it often, issuing his own early warnings against the politically correct.
And all the tales of fantasy and horror in the future, all burned heartlessly. They passed a law. What started innocently enough, with one group or another, political bias, religious prejudice, union pressures, there's always a minority afraid of something. And a great majority afraid of the past, afraid of the future, afraid of themselves.
I see.
The curse of the senses, Bigelow. With a screw tightened here and a bolt fastened there and a pull and a push. Art and literature are like a great twine of taffy, twisted into knots. So there's no longer any resiliency or flavor to it. The film cameras stop. The theaters are dark. The printing presses grind to a halt.
I'm sorry. I don't know what you're talking about. But from what I hear, the burning was a good thing.
Get out! Leave me alone, you idiot!
The angry Bradbury is there throughout history. I think I've proved it with a lot of my stories. You have to be angry about the right things, though, huh? You have to make a stand and move against people when they're incorrect, and get out of a situation. Like I'll give you a good example. I went in for a meeting at NBC 15 years ago. They wanted to do a series with me, and they had all the vice presidents lined up there and the paper waiting to be signed with the ink and everything. Yeah, at the last moment, one of the vice presidents leaned forward and said, "Mr. Bradbury, what we don't want from you is anything too highfalutin, huh? Highfalutin." And I said, "Highfalutin? Highfalutin?" I grew up in weird tales, astounding stories, astonishing stories, penny a word, pulp fiction, huh? And he realized he'd said something wrong. And he stopped and thought. He says, "Well, what we really want from you is something like Franz Kafka." I said, "Franz Kafka? Franz Kafka?" Well, now, that's highfalutin. And I went around the room and I put out my hand. I said, "Bye, bye, bye-bye, bye." And I left the meeting, and that killed the deal. Yeah. So I got angry. I knew exactly they were the enemy. And they invent a machine that listens to the ink dry on the contract. And as soon as it's dry, they ask you to change things. Huh?
By the mid-1950s, the Bradbury imagination was in full flight. If he wasn't trying to perfect humanoid robots or deal with the problems of creatures who could take on multiple personalities, he was taking weekend hunting trips into the world of the dinosaurs. The magazines were clamoring for his work when he got a call from movie director John Huston. Huston was perhaps the hottest Hollywood director of his day. He made The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of Sierra Madre, The Red Badge of Courage. He just finished The African Queen, and fresh from Bogart and Hepburn and Africa, he called 33-year-old Ray Bradbury over to his hotel in Los Angeles.
He took me in and sat me down, put a drink in my hand, and stood over me and looked down at me and said, well, Ray, what are you doing during the next year? And I said, not much, Mr. Huston, not much. He said, well, tell you what, Ray, how'd you like to come, live in Ireland, and write the screenplay of Moby Dick? And I said, gee, Mr. Huston, I've never been able to read the damn thing. And then he'd never heard that before from any writer. And he said, well, I tell you what, kid, why don't you go home tonight, read as much as you can, and come back tomorrow and tell me if you'll help me kill the white whale. And I went home and I said to my wife, pray for me. And she said, why? I said, because I've got to read a book tonight and do a book report tomorrow. And I read as much as I could and went back and took the job, and the rest is history. The way I read Moby Dick was the right way, huh? Impulsively leapfrogging through the entire book. I just jumped up and dove into any page, and I opened it, and there was a metaphor, the spirit spout, sprinkling the deeps of the ocean at 3 a.m., the soul's midnight, huh? And then going on to becalmment and going on to the description of the spirit spout itself, like a giant fountain of Versailles. And then late in the book, I came upon the wonderful soliloquy where Ahab stands at the rail and says, it's a mild, mild day and a mild-looking sky. And the wind blew from the shadow of the Andes where the mowers have lain down with their scythes. And I turned back to the beginning and I read, call me Ishmael. And I was in love. And I went the next day and took the job. Thank God, thank God.
But as the screenplay progressed, Ray Bradbury would not be thanking God, for the job in Ireland with John Huston would become a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
Senator, your mouth has amazed this pen.
John Huston had moved to Ireland and had fallen in love with the place. He would eventually become an Irish citizen. He rented a huge country house at Kilcock, an hour outside of Dublin, and took up residence as the country squire. Bradbury was expected to work in the city and bring out draft after draft of the screenplay, but the relationship soon deteriorated.
He was a strange, emotional man, John Huston. And he took these fits of meanness, and for no reason.
Huston's son Tony was only 4 when the saga at Kilcock was unfolding.
My impression is that they were ideally unsuited to each other. That on the surface, here you have 2 characters who are massively talented, but Dad was a very sophisticated individual. He enjoyed playing poker, he respected art and things like that. And without knowing Mr. Bradbury, the impression I formed is that he has a kind of basic innocence. And as soon as Dad spotted this, of course, he became Dad's mug. Especially when he realized that Mr. Bradbury was very suggestible.
I remember having lunch with him one day with two strangers, two reporters from London. And all of a sudden, in the middle of lunch, John looks down and cutting his steak, and he says, "You know, I really don't feel that my young friend here, Ray Bradbury, has his heart in writing the screenplay of Moby Dick." Well, you know, I put down my knife and fork. My stomach froze. I couldn't eat anything, couldn't drink, sat there for the whole lunch. And we went back to the hotel, and when we got up to the room for a meeting, John looked at me and says, "What's wrong, Ray?" I said, "What's wrong? Did you hear yourself at lunch? You hear what you said? That I don't care? That I'm not giving my heart and soul for this project? How could you say that? I'd kill for this project. I'm proud to be here working for you in Melville." Oh, Ray, that was a joke. That was a joke, Ray." And he ran forward and embraced me, and I burst into tears. And I said, "Don't do it again. You know, I can't stand it." It was like a bad marriage, you know. I was his wife, and he's burping me, He's burping me. And then we make up, and a couple days go by, and he do something the same way. So very strange, very sad.
Dad hated bores. He also said that, you know, Bradbury spoke in nothing but cliches. And this to Dad would, I can just see him now just wincing. And that, out of that wincing would come the desire to stick his finger in the wound and get a little malicious, maybe.
By the time the screenplay was finished, so was the relationship between Ray Bradbury and John Huston.
I have nightmares. For years after that, he showed up at the house in the middle of the nightmare, and there'd be a rapping on the door, and I'd get out of the bed and I'd run down the front door, open it, and John Huston would be standing there with a snorkel outfit and the glass over his eyes and the oxygen tanks and a spear and a sword, you know, and he'd say, "Oh, come on, Ray, I'm going to take you down the ocean and teach you how to snorkel." I said, "No, John, I don't want to do it." "No, don't be a coward, Ray. Don't be yellow. We're going to go down the ocean, and I'm going to teach you how to snorkel." And he takes me down, and he drowns me, and then I wake up. That's the nightmare that went on in my life for the next several years after the premiere.
It would take almost 40 years before Ray Bradbury was finally able to write about his time in Dublin and Kilcock.
Here you are.
But when he did, he produced a full-length novel called Green Passage, White Whale, and inside the novel, a short story, The Banshee.
God be with you, but I must be with someone. Might as well be you.
In real life, Bradbury refused to revisit Ireland, but he did return to it in his novel and short story, and was finally able to exercise the whole sad experience.
Did I scare you, kid? Get in out of that night before it grabs you.
John?
Get this in you, kid. So you finished the screenplay. This is it. So you say.
Oh, I wrote the short story about the Banshee, about John Huston many years later, because when I lived in Ireland and I'd go out there at night to his house, he used to try to scare me. The wind would blow around the house, and we'd be sitting by the fireplace at midnight, you know, and every once in a while he'd lean forward and he says, "Ray, you hear that outside?" I said, "What do you mean, John?" "You hear that wailing outside the house, Ray?" "Yeah, yes." "You know what that is, Ray? You know what that is? That's a banshee. It's a banshee. Goes to the dead. Tell you what, Ray, take my coat, go out, and bring the banshee in." "No, John, I don't want to. Don't be alone, Ray. Come on, take my coat and bring the banshee in." I said, "John, if I know you got someone out there making those noises just as a joke to get me out there." So I refused to go.
Toro. It's waiting. Get out there. Run for the team.
So later I wrote the short story, and the same thing happens in the short story, except I go out and the banshee's really there. Huh?
Don't be yellow, kid! Banshee, where are you?
It's far enough.
And she talks to me, and it's one of his women that he hurt in another time when he had another character with another name 200 years before. A man similar to John Huston created trouble with all these women and hurt them terribly and left them. And so she says, send him out to me. And I said, what will you do with him? She said, I'll lay down with him and never get up again. And so I go in the house, and John, who sent me out on a joke, he says, well, how was it, kid? And I said, she's out there, John. He says, what do you mean? He says, she's out there, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. There's only one problem. What's that, kid? She's dead. She's been dead a long time, but she wants you to come out. She's beautiful.
Young, you say, and beautiful, and out there right now.
Put your coat on. It's a cold night.
God. She's really there.
Wait. There's one thing I forgot to tell you. The woman is out there, all right. She's walking. But she's dead.
I'm not afraid.
No, but I am.
And he goes out, and the banshee gets him. Nice story, huh? Comeuppance time.
Mark Hamill and Ray Don Chong star in a Sci-Fi Channel premiere feature.
In the last few years, Ray Bradbury has been busy on the speaker circuit, traveling to a different city almost every week to speak or lecture, depending on how he feels. Today in Vancouver, it sounds more like a lecture.
I demand of you a total knowledge of all the arts, and you got plenty of time and you're wasting it often. You go have lunch with people who bore the out of you, huh? Cut it out. Cut out the lunches, huh?
Great speech, Mr. Bradbury.
Thank you, thank you.
I enjoy your work very much.
Thank you so much.
Wherever he goes, his popularity is immense, but even with a heavy lecture schedule, he still writes every day. He's currently working on 2 screenplays, a new book of essays, 6 or 7 short stories, and 2 new plays. Something to think about as he faces his 75th birthday.
This is my 75th birthday week, and when you turn 75, you get philosophical, at least for an hour. And the constant feeling I have is I'm glad to be inside here with that other person. There's a guy named Ray Bradbury out there in the world somewhere, and I suddenly realize I'm him, huh? But they're the 2 halves of me, the half that creates and the half that watches. And the muse talks to me in the morning, and I obey and get up and do what it wants. And this is a development of maybe the last 35 years. It didn't happen to me when I was a teenager. I was too young. But I've learned to respect these inspirations that come, and don't argue with them, just get it done. So I'm lodged in here and feel fortunate that God gave me the genetics and that I had enough sense to use them.
The God-given gift and the sense to use it has led to a host of honors. The O. Henry Memorial, the Benjamin Franklin Award, the Grand Masters Award from the Science Fiction Writers of America. But there still is in the quiet moments a head-shaking disbelief, still a bewilderment that the kid from Waukegan, Illinois, has earned a place as a fixture in contemporary American literature. It's a bewilderment that every so often still keeps Ray Bradbury awake and writing.
People come up to me and tell me I'm a darn good writer, and that's good. Huh? I hope I will be forgiven for an act of terrible ego, but often nights when I can't sleep, I'll get up in the middle of the night. I wander down the living room. I got all my books lined up there. I'll just take one off the shelf for the hell of it and open it in the middle and begin to read. And God, it's good stuff. Huh? It is very good stuff. I'm very proud because my intuition is there, you see. There's nothing mechanical. And I'm so proud I follow the middle way instead of the commercial way or the political way. And I read that and tears come to my eyes because I know that I've done something right.
Embark on a journey past the shadowy edge of reality to a land whose only boundaries are those of the imagination, a place known as the Twilight Zone. Coming up next, exclusively on the Sci-Fi Channel.